Good afternoon, welcome. We're really glad to have you this afternoon. As the Zoom technology filters people in, we'll wait till most folks are gathered. It's a lot faster than getting through ballroom doors in person, so we'll try to be patient. There are a lot of folks on the line today, not surprising, but certainly an indication that we have a lot to talk about. Get started in just a moment. Knowing how busy you all are, um, let me begin. Hello. Welcome to this special joint webinar on budget reconciliation and the charitable sector. Again, we've got a lot to talk about today at this critical juncture for our sector. There are a lot of you on, there are more of you joining by the moment, but because your time is really valuable, I'm going to get started. I'm Ben Kershaw. I direct government relations and public policy for Independent Sector, a national membership organization for charities, foundations, and corporate giving programs. I'm your MC today, but this webinar is jointly presented by 4 organizations, as you see here on the slide. These organizations work together closely always. We are admittedly working together especially closely right now. The moment demands it. So I'm glad to be joined today by counterparts at each of these organizations. I encourage you to read their impressive biographies on our event page, but they are Jen Holcomb, VP of Government Affairs and Legal Resources at the Council on Foundations, Matthew L. Evans, VP of Advocacy and External Relations at United Philanthropy Forum, and Sarah Sadian, VP of Public Policy and Campaigns at National Council of Nonprofits. Last but not least, we also have with us today Wes Coulomb, the Managing Director of Washington Counsel Ernst & Young, a longtime Senate insider and a trusted confidant to many of us. So some housekeeping notes off the top. This is a webinar. Your lines are muted. We will pause periodically to answer questions. Please enter them in the Q&A box whenever you have them. We don't expect to be able to answer every question today, but we will do our best. If you have technical difficulties, email publicpolicy@independentsector.org. This webinar is being recorded. We will email you that recording, including some key action items in the coming days. If you didn't register, but you want to be sure to get that email, again, please email publicpolicy@independentsector.org. So before we start, I want to respectfully acknowledge I'm joining you today from Washington, D.C. It's the ancestral home of the Piscataway people who are still in the area working to reclaim their land and their traditional practices. Also, many of the buildings and the places we inhabit in Washington, D.C. were built by enslaved people. Wherever you are joining us from, we're glad to have you. So Congress is working furiously to pass one big, beautiful bill, which would implement much of President Trump's agenda on taxes, healthcare, energy policy, and more. Any proposal of this size and scope is going to have significant ramifications for our sector and the people we serve. But the version that passed the House of Representatives last week could be particularly damaging for all of us and the people we serve. So we're going to talk about the outlook for that legislation and some critical ways that you can take action today. But first, let's try to understand what's in the bill. It's over 1,000 pages long, and Jen and Matthew, I don't think, are going to read us all of those pages. So I'm going to turn it over to them to talk about how we can best understand what's in the bill and what impact it would have on our sector. Over to you, Jen and Matthew.
Yeah, no reading the bill, although that is a new idea for getting my kids to go to sleep tonight. So my kids may be starting to hear it. There we go. Thank you so much, Ben. And I really want to say thank you to the entire independent sector team for doing all the back end work of getting this webinar together, registration, all the things that need to happen. As we all know, when I'm sure everyone on this call has had to either produce or do a webinar. So thank you all for everything you guys are doing. And it's great to be in partnership with you, independent sector, with United Philanthropy Forum and National Council of Nonprofits on so many things, but especially at this time. So as Ben said, last week, the House passed their reconciliation package, titled One Big Beautiful Bill. And the vote was really close. I think it was 215 to 214. It's over 1,000 pages long. There's tons of things in here. And so much of the bill is going to impact just kind of every part of our sector. Or not sector, our economy. And there's just no way we can get into everything. So I want to just start with a really high level overview of what was in the bill. Knowing that Wes, as Ben said, is going to come in later and probably supplement and talk through a lot of this as well, much better than I can. Primarily, though, this bill does a few things. First, it satisfies some, if not all, of the Republican priorities that they campaigned on leading up to the 2024 election. So it extends many, but not all, of the expiring provisions from the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Those provisions, many of them were set to expire at the end of the year, and the House passed bill extends some of them, permanently, and others for various limitations. So it does that, kind of checks that box. It includes several provisions that were part of President Trump's campaign promises, including the no taxes on overtime earned during a specific period of time. It allows for an extra deduction for seniors to make good on the president's pledge of no tax on Social Security benefits. But again, that provision has specific kind of limitations on it. And I think it includes a phase out for seniors as with higher incomes. So it does, a lot of things. It does a lot of things that the Republican majority right now has said that they want to do in this package. It also includes new spending and some changes to national security, border enforcement, and immigration spending. Specifically, it includes money for President Trump's border wall, among other things. But to pay for these, kind of all these different promises, all these items that the Republican majority has said they want to do, it also includes some significant cuts to domestic spending and domestic priorities. And I know my colleague Matthew is going to go much more into detail of a few of these, so I'll let him do that. But lastly, what it does is it also increases the statutory debt limit for the US. So Secretary Besson has said that the US could run out of money as early, I think, as August right now. And so the bill lifts the national debt limit by about $4 trillion. There's so much more in this bill. Like I said, that's just a very high level overview. If you're looking for specific things that we don't get to today or that none of our organizations are focused on, I am sure that we will be able to point you to a summary from one of the many organizations following this bill that can provide more detail. But, as we get more into this, the overlapping policy issues that our organizations are really focused on right now concern the tax policies and those that are really focused on kind of this charitable sector. Together, our focus has really been on how do we lift up the problems with some of the provisions that disincentivize charitable giving, both from individuals as well as organizations. And I think I can say, well, each of these provisions that you're seeing will by itself have an impact on the sector. Together, the impact is just so much greater and is going to put a strain on organizations already feeling the effects of reduced funding from federal and state governments, reduced charitable giving, among other things. So I'm going to go through the first two and then let Matthew go through the second two. So this first one, the House passed version of the bill creates a new limit on itemized deductions, including the charitable deduction. So high income taxpayers, those in the top 37% bracket, would be subject to an overall reduction in the value of their itemized deductions starting in 2026. And I think the bill caps it at 35 cents for every itemized dollar, if I'm right. Now, what we know is that these donors make up a significant portion of the total charitable contributions that nonprofits depend on to advance their work and serve their communities. For 2024, I think the fundraising effectiveness project found that total donations increased in 2024, but the number of donors is actually decreasing. That means what we're seeing is a lot more bigger donations from high income individuals. And so anything that's going to incentivize them from giving at this time is going to have a big impact on the broader sector. So that's the first one. And we all have concerns about that. The second one is almost like a Frankenstein provision. It's related to UBIT, unrelated business income tax. The current law maintains that or says that nonprofits have to pay taxes on gross income for activities that constitute an unrelated trade or business. The House passed version of the bill includes or brings back a provision that was included in the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, but later repealed because of the strong advocacy of the nonprofit sector. What the provision does is it applies a tax on the expenses for qualified transportation fringe benefits, i.e., the tax of cost of providing parking and stuff for employees. And it clarifies that income from scientific research is exempt from tax only if the research is publicly available. Now, I was looking at independent sector summary, and one of the things that they have highlighted is that this tax, the research at the time showed that very similar provision that was passed, like I said, in 2017, would have a cost of an average of $12,000 for each impacted organization. And so, these are just two of the provisions. But again, we're seeing this kind of broad impact in the reconciliation bill on the tax exempt sector. And so I'm going to let Matthew go through the next two.
Thanks, Jen. Really appreciate it. My name is Matthew L. Evans. As Ben said, I am the Vice President of Advocacy and External Relations for United Philanthropy Forum. Proud to be here with our partner organizations in this collective advocacy work. So as Jen mentioned, just wanted to go over two important provisions that directly threaten not only the financial resources available for philanthropic endeavors, but also resources for communities. And so I want to start with the tiered tax increase on private foundations. As you can see on your screen, there's four sort of provisions that we're working with here. It is a significant, or this provision represents a significant restructuring of the excise tax on private foundations' net investment income. And as you see on your screen, it's based on asset size. So foundations with assets below 50 million will maintain the current rate at 1.39%. As some of you may remember, we worked to get that rate a few years back. But now with the provisions in this bill, foundations with assets between 50 million and 250 million, that rate doubles to 2.78%. And so on. And so you see a rate increase of 5% for foundations with assets between 250 million and 5 billion. And then for foundations with assets above $5 billion, the rate increases to an unprecedented 10%. A tiered tax system like this punishes foundations for scale, growth, and innovation, and in turn, communities end up paying the price. And what is that price? By our estimations and doing some research with Candid, the estimated total tax increase would be $2.90 billion annually. That's $2.9 billion annually gone from communities to pay for tax cuts. And so that's an important number to remember, and also sort of underscores how impactful these tax increases may be. And I know some may be wondering, well, this only impacts foundations of a certain size. We wholly believe that if this provision were to pass, that opens the door for future taxation on foundations of all types and sizes. So this is a crucial provision that we are paying attention to, and it has the tax increases on these assets had a dramatic tax on also community resources. These funds that would otherwise flow directly to nonprofits addressing critical needs such as supporting food banks, health clinics, and educational programs, or even arts and culture, and much more. The diversion of potentially billions of dollars from charitable work to government revenue will diminish the grant-making capacity of foundations nationwide. We believe that this will disproportionately harm communities that rely on consistent foundation support, especially those working to address systemic inequities or support underserved populations. Furthermore, this tax could stifle the innovation, risk-taking initiatives that foundations uniquely support to pilot solutions for complex societal challenges, and may compel foundations to adopt more conservative grant-making strategies to preserve their endowments, thus again impacting long-term community investment. And so this is a major provision that we're watching and we're working to remove from this harmful tax package. The next piece is a proposal, again, going after charitable giving, the new 1% AGI floor for corporate giving. Under this provision, corporations would only be permitted to deduct charitable contributions that exceed 1% of their adjusted income. This, again, we believe would have irreparable harm that could significantly dampen corporate philanthropy. As you know, many local nonprofits, cultural institutions, and community initiatives depend on support of businesses of all sizes. And even currently, not every corporate giving program or corporate entity goes over the 1% that this provision would leave as a floor. So by reducing this tax incentive for giving, especially for small and medium-sized businesses or those whose current giving falls below this new 1% threshold, this provision risks a substantial decrease in corporate support for local programs, sponsorships, and employee engagement in community service. It ultimately weakens the vital partnerships between businesses as well as the communities that they operate in and work in and with. I also wanted to go over other provisions in this bill that will lead to increased demand on nonprofits due to spending cuts. And so what we're seeing is sort of a two-pronged approach here. This bill is not only going after the way philanthropy operates to help communities, is also going after items within that communities depend on for support. So if enacted, this would lead to an inevitably a large surge in demand of services provided by nonprofit organizations. So first, we'll start with the Medicaid cuts. The impact on community health and stability is a major concern. The proposed changes to Medicaid, potentially including reduced eligibility or new work requirements, could result in millions losing access to essential healthcare. This would lead to a deteriorating public health outcomes, increased medical debt for families, and an immense strain on community health clinics, free clinics, and safety net hospitals, many of which are nonprofits. The burden would fall heavily on vulnerable populations, including children, new mothers, seniors, and individuals with disabilities, magnifying existing health disparities. More cuts that are mentioned or provisions that are in this bill include cuts to SNAP, and that would have an impact, of course, on food security and basic needs. The concern here is that potential reductions in SNAP benefits or stricter eligibility criteria would directly increase food insecurity for countless families and individuals across the country. Nonprofit food banks and pantries, which are already operating beyond capacity, would face an unimaginable increase in demand. These consequences of heightened food insecurity are severe, impacting children's nutrition, development, and educational success, as well as the overall health and stability of our communities. And finally, I want to talk about the impact of economic well-being as it relates to the student loan overhaul. The concern here is that changes to the student loan repayment plans or forgiveness programs could increase the financial burden on millions of Americans. And I'm sure you've already heard news reports about folks' credit scores being impacted almost immediately by some of the changes made outside of this bill. And so this provision could already exacerbate that. This heightened financial stress can reduce individuals' capacity for charitable donations and may increase their reliance on nonprofit services for financial counseling, emergency assistance, and other support. So these provisions, combined with the ones I mentioned earlier, there's sort of a compounding effect, a challenging horizon, not only for the sector, but also the communities. These proposals do not exist in a vacuum. The simultaneous reduction of philanthropic resources and the scaling back of public support systems would create a perfect storm. The nonprofit sector would be called upon to address significantly greater community needs with potentially far fewer resources. This dynamic threatens to widen service gaps, leave many vulnerable individuals and families without the support they desperately need. So this is a moment for our sector to stand united, not just to protect the institutions, but to defend the communities we are accountable to.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Jen. We've covered a lot of ground, and we have a couple minutes to pause for questions about what you just heard before we move on to some actions that you can take. So I think the first question I want to go back to is a question about the candid number that you cited again, Matthew. It's such a powerful statistic. Could you name that for us again?
Sure, Ben. That number is 2.90 billion. That's the estimated total annual tax increase for the affected foundations that we listed within those tiered categories.
Thank you. We have a number of questions about the structure of the corporate floor Matthew talked about. So I'll just note really quickly that right now there is no floor for corporations donating income. For corporations claiming a deduction when they make a donation, just as there is no floor for individuals who claim a deduction. There is a limit, an annual limit of 10% that corporations can write off at max, which they can roll over to future years. If they don't have corporate profits to show, then they don't pay corporate income tax. So they don't need a deduction. They can roll it over.
Ben, if I could just interject there. So on the individual side, it is tied to AGI. On the corporate side, it's actually taxable income. So it's 10% taxable income is the max, and they include in this new bill a new 1% floor of taxable income. So those contributions below 1% would not be allowed to be tax deductible for a corporate taxpayer.
Thank you, Wes.
Yep.
Lots of great questions. We will not get to them all. I want to make sure we move on. Again, with thanks to Jen and Matthew. There are other provisions in this bill, again, in that chart we shared that we may have time to discuss later. But as Jen and Matthew emphasized, each of those 4 key tax provisions would make it harder for our sector to do our work individually, and certainly collectively, they could be really damaging. Thankfully, this is not just a webinar to scare and to alarm you. This is a chance for us all to do something really important together. Sarah Sadian is still relatively new to the National Council of Nonprofits. Boy, are we lucky to have her in our sector. She's going to talk a little bit more about some opportunities for action that our 4 organizations stand behind. Sarah,
Thanks.
over to you.
Thank you, Ben. So it's absolutely critical that you are making your voice heard with your members of Congress about these tax provisions and the harm that they're going to do to the people that you serve and the communities that you participate in. Some organizations on this call, like foundations, are not allowed to lobby their member of Congress. So we're going to put them aside for the moment. Everybody else, including nonprofits, are not only legally allowed to engage their member of Congress on this issue, but you should think of it as being really critical to achieving your own mission. So there are 2 ways that you can take action today. The first is to sign a national letter and share it with your networks by June 2nd. This letter is being led by our 4 organizations, and it focuses on those 4 tax provisions that we went over earlier that would directly target the nonprofit sector. It doesn't touch on every issue in the tax bill, so if you care about those issues too, You should please continue to engage your members of Congress on them as well. The bill does not include, for example, references to the university tax or the above the line deduction or Medicaid cuts. Instead, we're really laser focused in this national letter on those provisions that we think are most harmful to the sector as a whole, and where we think we could make some changes, some improvements, or removing them entirely from the bill as well. These are the provisions that we think we might be able to convince Republicans as they move forward on the bill. Second, you can use our email template to email your members of Congress as well. And in the chat box, you'll see links that you can use right now. We're going to hear later on about the timing and the path forward for this bill, but suffice it to say, we have a really short window of time and a very steep hill to climb if we're going to be successful at removing these provisions from the bill. So it's important that you're engaging your members of Congress, the sooner the better. And the more consistently, the more often, more frequently, the even better over the next couple of weeks. One touch isn't enough. You are going to want to continue to engage your member of Congress over the next several weeks. Next slide. In terms of our overall message, we want to make clear that Congress shouldn't harm the people who rely on nonprofits to pay for tax cuts. It's important that we're focusing on those who are most harmed, which aren't organizations and it aren't the foundations themselves, but the people who rely on those services provided by nonprofits. The people who are served by disaster relief organizations, who get food from food banks, who are in drug recovery programs provided by nonprofits, and many more. It's really about the people, not the institutions. And we want to make sure that that message is getting across to Congress. We also want to share that nonprofits are already lean and mean, and they're not going to be able to absorb the loss of resources. Most nonprofits are operating under very small budgets. They're making every dollar stretch. And to see a pushback in terms of how much resources they have available to them means that they will not be able to serve the same number of people in their communities going forward. We also want to emphasize that this is not just an urban issue. In fact, rural and suburban communities are going to be most harmed. And that's because most nonprofits are located in rural and suburban communities, and because those communities are more likely to rely on nonprofits to fill the gap of what government can't and won't do. But you know your member of Congress best, so use your judgment based on what you know about them and what message might connect with them the most. Next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about who our targets are, and I'm going to start with Republicans because Republicans are using this process, budget reconciliation, that's going to let them pass this tax bill without any Democratic votes. They can pass the bill in the Senate with a simple majority rather than the 60 votes that we normally see. That means Republicans have all the leverage, all the decision-making power. So if you have limited time, start with your Republican members of Congress first. We have a list of our targets here in the Senate. These are folks who are either in leadership positions, are on key committees, are champions of the nonprofit sector, or who are generally considered to be more moderate leaning than the rest of the party. But if your Republican senator is not on this list, please don't take that as an invitation not to call them. Every single Republican member of Congress needs to hear from you about this tax bill and about these provisions. Next slide. What about the Democrats? Well, you should also be engaging your Democratic members of Congress too. And I know I just said that Republicans hold really the legislative keys to this process, and that's true. But Democratic members of Congress also need to know about these provisions and the impact that it will have on their communities. They can help amplify these issues. They can help frame the narrative with media. They can help create the public narrative around the importance of nonprofits and how these provisions will hurt communities. And ultimately, that can also help put pressure on Republicans to remove the provisions from the bill as they move forward. So in closing, I just want to invite folks to use our resources, sign the national letter, share it really widely, ask everyone in your state to do the same and to take action. And I think we can have a real impact here. Thankfully, the nonprofit sector has already proven how effective we are when we work collectively to advocate for something. An earlier draft of this bill included a harmful provision that would have granted unprecedented authority to the executive branch to revoke nonprofit status without due process. But that provision was removed, and it was removed because nonprofits joined together collectively to make our voices heard and to raise concerns about it. So we can build on that success by doing the same here with the provisions that we talked about earlier. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ben.
Thank you, Sarah. We really appreciate it. And we have a moment for a couple questions about the letter before we move on. People are asking, where will the letter be published? Is it safe to say that this will be published on the National Council of Nonprofits website, maybe as well as some of ours?
Yeah, when the time is right. So we're asking for people to sign on by June 2nd. We're going to assess at the time if we need to extend that deadline or not. But when it's ready to publish it, we're going to share it widely and share it with every congressional office so that they can see just how broad the stakes are, how broadly these provisions are raising concerns. And so we'll make sure everybody can get a copy of that too. We might be able to circle back to everybody who's registered, and we'll publish it on our website and the other websites as well.
And can you reiterate that deadline for us, Sarah?
Yeah, the deadline to sign on is June 2nd, which is fast approaching. That's also the day that the Senate comes back from their recess. And we want to be prepared to hit the ground running as soon as they start to turn their attention to the tax bill.
So we're getting questions about who's allowed to sign this letter and who isn't. So there's a question about whether 501c3 nonprofits can sign this letter. And we're all firmly in agreement that that answer is yes. Could I ask Jen or Matthew to chime in on the thinking around private foundations and lobbying on this bill overall versus this particular letter?
Sure, I can chime in, and Jen, feel free. So yes, it's important to make a distinction that private foundations can lobby for the provisions that impact them specifically in the bill. So maybe for this letter, we know that there are provisions that don't impact private foundations, but in your own lobbying, when you're working with your organizations or your philanthropic infrastructure organizations or other foundation partners, that for the provisions that we laid out earlier, specifically when it comes to the excise tax, as well as the excise tax, as well as the universal charitable deduction, private foundations can lobby for those provisions. So just wanted to make that clear. That is what we call the self-defense exception. And we know that there is a lot of questions about that. And we know that there's some trepidation from some folks within the sector about lobbying. But when it comes to the provisions that directly impact private foundations, they are allowed to lobby. They cannot do grassroots lobbying, which is, they can't ask their grantees to then send a letter to a member of Congress in support or in opposition to a piece of legislation or provision. But they can themselves work to lobby in self-defense for those provisions.
The only thing I would clarify is, so self-defense exception is not lobbying. So that's, just self-defense communication. So clear there. And I think this is one of those where, my understanding is the charitable deduction in the bill excludes private foundations. And so that would be one also I would say would fall outside of that exception. But the Charitable Act that Senator Langford and Representative Moore have introduced in their respective houses, I think would fall within that. So just, being mindful of what we're talking about. But as Matthew and Sarah both said, this is a place where public charities absolutely should sign and can sign the letter. And we know that private foundations are doing their work to communicate with their lawmakers through ways that, that they're allowed to through the self-defense communication exception.
Thank you both. Thank you again, Sarah. I know all three of you will stick around for more questions. Now that we have a good understanding of what's in the bill and some critical ways that organizations can help, Let's talk about where the process goes from here. So how long might we have to turn some of this ship? I'm going to turn now to Wes Coulomb. Thanks for your patience, Wes, and your help. Wes is an experienced insider on all things Congress, but has spent particular time working with and thinking about Senate Republicans who, as you just heard from Sarah, hold many of the cards right now. Wes, can you tell us a little bit about sort of the immediate next steps for this bill and what we know about the ultimate timeline?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And Ben, great information thus far. The previous speakers kind of laying out what the Congress has done thus far to date. Obviously, the big picture here is about $40+ billion in tax increases on the nonprofit sector. Given the various provisions that are in the House bill, they're going to cause lots of concern amongst the nonprofit sector and charities generally across the country. So the bigger picture here is obviously their Republicans are trying to get the bill passed through the House and the Senate and on the president's desk this summer. Different deadlines have been thrown out there, but they're really in the process now of taking the House bill and putting it on the Senate calendar to consider it in the Senate. The Senate is in session beginning next week, and their goal is to try to finish a bill through the Senate by the end of the month of June. They have basically a 4-week process on their calendar to do that before the July 4th break. They're out for a week, the first week of July. So the Senate, like the House, has instructions on the budget resolution to the various committees to either increase spending or cut spending in various ways, including the same thing we've seen in the House bill, Medicaid, SNAP, etc., ag programs, student loan programs, and increased spending, for example, on defense and other areas as well. And then the Senate Finance Committee is also tasked with come up with a tax package similar to what the House has put together. The Senate instructions are a little bit different in the sense that they have the ability to use a current policy baseline. So they basically assume under the current policy baseline that all of the 2017 tax cuts that expire end of this year are assumed to be made permanent and therefore don't need to be scored from a revenue standpoint on the revenue scorecard. They also have instructions for additional $1.5 trillion additional debt deficit increase to pay for or accommodate other tax cuts they want to include in that package. So the pressure for revenue increases on the Senate is less than the House, and so we're hoping that will alleviate ability pressure for them to push back on some of and be able to push back for us on some of the provisions in the bill that are tax increases on the nonprofit sector. So the approach in the Senate can take two forms. One, they can take a markup of the various pieces of the bills in the various committees in the Senate, and then report those to the Budget Committee, and then go to the Senate floor. Well, the full Senate will have the ability to amend and vote on the final product as it passes through the Senate. What I have been hearing is that there's conversations about not doing committee markups. Some might have, but maybe not all. And in this case, the Senate Finance Committee is the committee of jurisdiction in the Senate that oversees tax policy as well as some of the healthcare policy in the overall reconciliation instructions. They could bypass the committee process, one, because they have just a 1-vote margin in the committee. You have some senators on the Republican side who are up for re-election and taking a series of votes in the committee and then on the Senate floor might be unattractive. And two, just for the sake of time, bypassing the committee might also be something they are considering. So it is no guarantee there will be a markup in the Senate Finance Committee on the tax package, and may, in fact, move the bill to the Senate floor directly under a process where the Senate majority will call up the House passed bill HR 1 and then offer a substitute amendment to replace the House bill with the product of the various committees that have kind of put together their packages as one big package and take that to the Senate floor for consideration and open to amendment process. So unlike the House, where it's a little bit closed process, the Senate floor process is very much open to amendments, where both Republicans and obviously in this case Democrats can offer amendments on the Senate floor, and that there's a time limit for reconciliation for the Senate to process the bill, but there is unlimited amount of time to consider amendments. They do what's called a vote-a-rama process that happens usually late in the night, early in the morning, and the last day that they're in session until they kind of run out of steam. and finally go to a final vote on the bill. So timing wise, like I said, they have 4 weeks in June to meet their goal of passing it by July 4th. They could then begin to put the bill together when they come back in session next week and have conversations amongst the members and leadership about where they want to go and putting the pieces of the bill together. I think there's a good chance they might take a couple weeks to do that and then put the bill on the Senate floor probably the 3rd week or 4th week of June for that debate and vote-a-rama and final passage of the bill in end of June. So we understand that the Senate has some issues with the scope and the size of the spending cuts, for example, on Medicaid and SNAP, like $750 billion in cuts to Medicaid, about $300 billion in SNAP. Some senators have already raised concerns about the size and depth of those cuts. I'd imagine the Senate is going to scale those cuts back and do a little bit less on that. And also on the tax bill, they're going to want to have, make their mark on some of these provisions and modify them and make changes to some provisions in the tax portion of the bill that came over from the House. And so we expect the Senate bill to be probably 80% the same, but 20% potentially different. We'll see how it goes on the size and scope of the package that the House put together, and the Senate will respond with their modified version. And then finally, you have obviously the debt limit in there. There is a provision there to increase the debt limit by about $4 trillion in the House bill. That will also have to be processed. One deadline that they need to be mindful of is the debt limit will come due sometime projected by Treasury sometime in the August-September timeframe. So I think there is a deadline here to get this bill done and signed into law if they include debt limit as part of the bill before they leave for the August recess, the first part of August. So they do have both June and July to do get a final bill put together. So let's assume the Senate passes the bill by the end of June. Then there's 2 options once the Senate bill has passed, with obviously changes to what the House passed, what the Senate passed. That would go to either the House for another vote, and if the House then takes up the Senate passed version without any changes and passes it in the House, it would then go to the President for his signature and become law. Obviously, the House passed their version by just 1 vote. And I imagine the vote in the Senate is going to be also very narrow, given they only have a 3-vote margin to play with in the Senate. And so any changes to the House bill made by the Senate could cause the votes, some issues with the votes in the House. And so the other option would be for them to either modify the bill in the House again and send it back to the Senate, or go to a conference committee like we saw in 2017, where they work out the differences between the House bill and the Senate bill, and they come up with a final version that they have to vote on again in the House and Senate before it goes to the President's desk. So, we're kind of early in the process here. Obviously, the House has done their work. We still have the Senate, and then obviously a final version to look to as part of our advocacy efforts. And so we have time here very quickly to kind of move and work on the Senate to make the bill better, improve what they did in the House. Happy to stop there and answer any questions or comments from folks on kind of where things are in the process and the outlook.
Thank you, Wes. We really appreciate that. Again, knowing how much still remains to be unknown. There are a number of questions about sort of scoring and cost and different baselines being used. Can you give us a quick refresher on some of that stuff? And then, does any of that stuff really matter?
Well, it doesn't matter in the past, but it matters this year in the sense that the Senate Republicans have decided to use what's called a current policy baseline, which doesn't change the actual real impact on the deficit of the provisions in the bill, but gives them the ability to look at the scoring as if the provisions in 2017 that expire are made permanent, and thus instead of, for example, costing $2 trillion to extend the lower rates that are currently in law, they would assume to be scored at 0 because they're assumed to be made permanent and not cost. So that gives the Senate bill the ability to do a little bit more to meet their reconciliation target, which is a $1.5 trillion increase in deficit above the current policy baseline. So if you add it all up, the House bill and the tax bill was about a net $4 trillion in deficit increase if you add up the tax cuts and the tax increases in the bill that net to about 3.9 or roughly $4 trillion. So the Senate could do a bill somewhere in the neighborhood of roughly about 5.3 trillion dollars overall in their package. So they could do a bigger tax package based on the current baseline assumption they have there. That's really what the ability is. It kind of really, it gives them the ability to make some of the provisions permanent and not sunset them after 10 years or a short period of time.
Thank you. We've had a few questions also about I think all of us have referenced Senator Lankford and the Charitable Act. Jen, can I ask you to just lay that out a little bit more for us?
Sure. I will apologize. I was answering a question and then I heard my name and I didn't hear the first part of it.
What's the Charitable Act, Jen?
So yeah, absolutely. So the Charitable Act is a bill that actually I think probably has almost universal support across the nonprofit charitable sector. It would create a charitable deduction for individuals who do not itemize. So for the vast majority of taxpayers right now, that is equal to I believe it's 1/3 the standard deduction. And I don't have the handy what it is in dollars off the top of my head for individuals and for joint filers, but it's a significant, it would be a significant, incentive for, really reigniting the charitable spirit and just really recognize all the contributions from so many individuals that, right now the charitable sector desperately needs. So I know that our organizations are all supportive, but the Charitable Giving Coalition also exists, and we are all members of that and is working hard to really pass that bill and get that enacted. And I think
Thank you, Jen.
yeah.
And so I think we would juxtapose the 1/3 of the standard deduction, which is about $5,000 for single filers, with the $150 limit on the charitable deduction for every American, the non-itemizer deduction in the version that passed the House of Representatives. And so on each of the four provisions that we're highlighting today and that are in this webinar and in this letter, you're seeing a revenue score of billions of dollars over 10 years, right? The private foundation piece alone is $16 billion. Whereas the cost of that $150 deduction is less than $7 billion in that bill. So, from a messaging perspective, this gets back to what Sarah noted, that this bill on a whole is using our sector as a way to raise revenue to pay for other stuff, let alone all of the spending cuts that are impacting the communities our organizations serve, and any increases in demand that might go along with it, let alone all the uncertainty about grant funding. So I think that bill has come up as, I think emphasis as how this is out of whack right now. And one way beyond striking these harmful provisions to maybe get this legislation back in a little bit more balance.
Yeah. Can I add one more thing to that, Ben? Just because I know it's come up too is, yes, get it back in balance. And the provisions that are really, attacking foundations and disincentivizing giving are not being used to pay for the very small increase in the charitable deduction. Those both exist in the bill, but I want to decouple, delink them. And I've seen, some arguments trying to say one is being paid for the other. That's not the case. They're both in the bill and they're both there. But I think, we know Congress can walk and chew gum. They can do both. They can incentivize individual giving and pass a much stronger charitable deduction for non-itemizers and take out the harmful provisions that would reduce charitable resources to communities.
We've had also a number of questions about the parking lot tax or the UBIT on fringe benefits, transportation fringe benefits. While I talk about that, I want to make sure you have all of our contact information. So this is a provision that Congress passed in very similar form in 2017 and immediately regretted once they understood the ramifications of it. And those ramifications were real world ramifications for organizations in our sector and the people they serve. And there were also political ramifications for them. So let's talk about the actual implications had this tax been implemented before Congress repealed it retroactively. So right now, nonprofit organizations can provide parking benefits to their employees. They can provide transit passes to their employees. They can allow their employees to put money pre-tax onto a benefits card to be used for parking or transit. Right? What this provision proposes is to make every dollar a nonprofit organization spends on those benefits to make it taxable at the way nonprofits pay taxes through unrelated business income, right? That rate is 21% right now. So again, this would impact any money a nonprofit spends either to pay for its employees to park in a parking lot, or if it owns the parking lot, it's not about value, it's about how much the nonprofit spends on paving the parking lot and painting the parking lot and lighting the parking lot. So, right, we could all look forward to tracking meticulously those expenses and then paying taxes on them every year. A study commissioned in 2019 found that for impacted organizations, this would cost about $12,000 on average. For big charities in urban areas, it would cost many, many more than that. So that's what some of the details on that provision were. And if you can hear my blood pressure rising, that sort of answers this other question about how this became a real political problem for legislators. And it should have been, right? Our sector was an outcry, and I think we would be again. So it's on all of us to remind them how disastrous this would be for the people we serve, and how much they really ought not go there for their own sake. Stepping off my soapbox, putting a moderator hat back on. I will note that this year's version of it tries to exempt organizations that don't file a 990. So it tries to exempt churches. In practice, it would still impact many, many religious organizations. There's a separate webinar tomorrow at noon about this provision that we're not hosting, our organizations aren't hosting, but we're happy to talk more about it then or share more resources. We're getting a number of questions also about how the budget reconciliation bill interplays with DOGE cuts and all of the uncertainty we've seen, both from the administration and in courts and with the skinny budget. Wes, could I ask you to say a little bit about where those topics intersect and where they differ?
A good question, Ben. So the reconciliation bill has both spending cuts and spending increases. So we've seen some of the spending cuts, for example, in Medicaid and SNAP as the two most prominent examples, but they also have $100+ billion for border security, $150 billion for defense spending. There are increases there in the package, and so there's additional spending in there as well, not just spending cuts. Obviously, the spending cuts overshadow some of the spending increases, but they're also in there. And this is separate than we see from the DOGE effort and a rescissions package that the president's supposed to send up to Congress, as well as the annual appropriations process that is separate from the reconciliation bill that does the annual discretionary appropriations amounts that is starting to move forward in the House and the Senate. On the Doge cuts, they can stop payment, make some modifications administratively, but for the most part, if they want to scale back spending, they have to send a rescissions package to Congress, which the president has indicated he will do, and about $9 billion is the amount they're looking at to have Congress enact actual rescissions or clawback or previous appropriated funding or spending as part of that effort. And then we're going to see the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee try to pass appropriations bills on the various, individual 12 appropriations bills, the different departments for the fiscal year ahead, 2026. That process is probably likely to be the same as we've seen in last year's, where they won't be able to reach an agreement on appropriations bills by the September 30th deadline. Obviously, there's a ways to go between now and then, but given the politics and what's going on, I'd imagine we're going to be looking at a CR into the fall once again. We're also waiting for the president to roll out a complete budget. He put out, kind of as you mentioned, a skinny budget or a scaled back version of high points of what his budget should include. We've not seen a large, detailed budget from the administration yet. And that's often the case. The first year of administration, they take time to get together, get organized, and get their budget submitted to Congress. So we'll see that. But as with past years, past budgets, Congress kind of does their own thing, and it's more instructional rather than dictate what the Appropriations Committee does with their process in the Senate, in the House.
Thank you, Wes. Lots to unpack and lots to continue following as this process moves forward. And speaking of moving forward, I want to just pull us back up as we have a couple minutes left with you all, and we're so grateful to so many of you for being with us and for engaging on this. I want to invite my fellow panelists for any closing words here or reminders about the letter. Matthew or Jen, is there anything you want to emphasize?
I would just emphasize that, and I think Sarah touched on this beautifully earlier, that we're stronger together. This is an unprecedented time for our sector. This is not hyperbole. And so we need all of you. We work together at the national level. We talk every day, it seems like at this point, but it's important because we care about these issues, but we also care about the communities that we work in and with. And so working in a collective state for collective advocacy and collaboration is important in this moment.
Thank you, Matthew.
+1.
Thank you,
That's
Jen.
true. That's great.
We're again grateful to you all, grateful to Matthew and to Sarah and to Jen and to Wes, and to Manuel and Taylor and Sola and everyone else on the IS team who is enabling us to gather and spend our time digging into tax policy and calls to action rather than searching for mute buttons and links. We know how important everyone's time is and how important your voices are. And we're so grateful that you spent some time and might consider lending your voice to some of this work. Thanks again. Have a good afternoon. Go get them.